All right, today we're jumping into one of the most chaotic, violent, and honestly, transformative periods in all of world history, the French Revolution. This was a time that didn't just shake France to its core, it sent shockwaves across the entire globe.
And really, this whole explainer is about trying to answer one huge question. I mean, think about it. What could possibly drive an entire nation to tear down centuries of tradition, execute its own king, and try to build a whole new world from the ashes? Well, let's find out.
To get to the bottom of this, we've got to rewind to the late 1780s. France at the time was the most powerful and populous country in Europe, but it was a kingdom teetering right on the edge of a complete collapse.
And this right here, this table, shows you the fundamental problem, the deep injustice of what was called the Ancien Regime, or the Old Order. Society was split into three groups, or estates. You had the clergy and the nobility, the first and second estates, making up maybe 2% of the population. But they held most of the wealth and paid almost zero taxes. The entire tax burden, the whole financial weight of the country, fell on the third estate. And who was that? Literally everyone else, 98% of the people.
But that staggering inequality? That was just one ingredient in a perfect storm. You've got this rising middle class, the bourgeoisie, who have money but zero political power. You have peasants who are being crushed by an ancient feudal system. At the same time, you have these radical new ideas about liberty and rights from Enlightenment thinkers spreading like wildfire. And to make matters even worse, the government was totally broke, partly from helping fund the American Revolution, and terrible harvests meant people were literally starving. And at the very top of it all, an indecisive king, Louis XVI, who was completely unable to deal with the crisis.
So by 1789, all that pressure had built up, and something had to give. The whole kingdom was basically a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
And when it finally exploded, the speed of it all was just breathtaking. In May, the king calls a meeting of the Estates General to try and fix the money problems. By June, the Third Estate just declares itself a national assembly. A month later, the people of Paris stormed the Bastille prison, this huge symbol of the king's power. Seriously, the entire old order was being dismantled in a matter of weeks.
And then in August, the Assembly puts out this incredible document. This is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It's filled with Enlightenment ideas, and it's a radical promise of a totally new society, one based on liberty and equality, not on who your parents were. This was the high point, the hopeful, idealistic phase of the revolution.
But yeah, that hope, it wasn't going to last. That beautiful dream of liberty very quickly spiraled into paranoia, war with all of France's neighbors, and just unimaginable bloodshed. And this was the point of no return, the execution of the king. After trying and failing to escape the country, Louis XVI was put on trial for treason, found guilty, and sent to the guillotine. With that single act, there was no going back. The French Republic was born in the king's blood.
What came next is maybe the most infamous part of the whole story. The Reign of Terror. France was surrounded by enemies, torn apart by civil war, and the radical new government, led by a guy named Maximilien Robespierre, decided to make terror the official policy. The goal was simple and brutal. Purge France of anyone suspected of being an enemy of the revolution. And the contrast between the dream of 1789 and the reality just a few years later is, well, it's chilling. The promise of liberty, it became mass arrests based on nothing but suspicion. Equality, that turned into sham trials where people were denied lawyers. And fraternity, brotherhood, that dissolved into a nightmare where neighbors were denouncing neighbors just to save their own skin. And that number you see, 17,000. That's just the official count of people executed by the guillotine. Thousands more died in filthy, overcrowded prisons or were just killed without any trial at all. The revolution had literally started to eat its own. Eventually, even its main architect, Robespierre himself, ended up facing that same blade.
So the terror eventually burns itself out, but it leaves France just completely exhausted and unstable. The nation was desperate for someone, anyone, who could bring back some kind of order, and they found him in a young, incredibly ambitious general.
See, the government that came in right after the terror was called the Directory. And honestly, it was a total mess. It was corrupt, it was weak, and pretty much everyone hated it. It created this huge power vacuum at the very top of French society.
And into that power vacuum steps a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte. He was perfectly positioned to take over.
First, he becomes a massive war hero with these brilliant victories. Then, in 1799, he uses that fame to march back to Paris and just overthrow the government in a coup. He sets up a new system, calling himself First Consul, which basically made him the dictator of France. Just like that, the revolution was over.
So, after all of that chaos, the terror, the wars, what was the point? What was left? Well, despite all of its dark and bloody turns, the revolution unleashed ideas that would permanently change not just France, but the entire world.
And at the very heart of that legacy, you have these three powerful words: liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, fraternity. This became the motto of the French Republic, an ideal that, for all its failures, the revolution had championed.
And you really can't overstate the impact. Across Europe, the revolution's ideas helped sweep away the last bits of feudalism. It gave rise to modern nationalism, this idea that a nation is its people, not its king. Even Napoleon, the guy who ended the revolution, ended up spreading its ideas, like legal reforms, all across the continent with his armies. It really did set the stage for the modern world, inspiring movements for freedom for the next 200 years.
But that brings us to the big final question, doesn't it? After a decade of absolute turmoil and so much bloodshed, did France just swap one kind of absolute ruler for another? It's the central paradox of the French Revolution, a messy, violent, and contradictory struggle that toppled a king only to pave the way for an emperor, all while changing the world forever.